My goodness. This is one of those passages that progressive pastors like myself tend to have a hard time with. I had one friend who always insisted on passing this on to the associate pastor whenever it came up, because it's not a very happy passage. You know, John sounds like an apocalyptic pastor shouting out fire and brimstone, and actually that's not far off. But when I was tempted to kind of gloss over this, I read a reminder by a professor over at Lutheran Seminary named Catherine Schifferdecker. Who? You like the name? Yeah, I mean, who am I to complain about somebody else's name? I'm just happy I know how to pronounce it. And that I'm calling her by the correct name. Very important. Yeah. So she sees this as a passage of good news. That God is not finished with us. And that is what I'm going to try to emphasize. I do want to start off, and this is a little bit different than what I have in my notes, because I've been nerding out on some John the Baptist goodness in scholarship, and I kind of feel like sharing some of that context with y'all. But I'm going to try to rein in some of it so that we end somewhat close to on time. So as you saw in our reading from Josephus of Antiquities of the Jews, he is an ancient historian, by the way. He was recruited by the Roman government during the War of the Jews. So this was the war in 70 AD that ended up wiping out much of Jerusalem, knocking the temple down, all of these things that keep coming up over and over again when we're talking about the written context of the Greek New Testament. And he has a lot to say about John the Baptist. In fact, he's got more to say about John the Baptist than he does about Jesus, quite interestingly. He says that John the Baptist was a good man. I mean, that's interesting. Let's just start with that. And he talks about the tremendous influence that John the Baptist had. He was out in the wilderness by the River Jordan, but let's not mistake this with being like a big vacant desert. He was near the crossroads. This is like being by the freeway. Yeah, it's the wilderness, but like it's a wilderness that people are entering into on their way to other places. And he is so revered by the people that when he is eventually butting heads with King Herod Antipas and put to death, and eventually there is a war in which Herod is defeated. And the people say, this must be God's will. This is God trying to show that John was awesome, and you had no right to do that, Herod. Okay, so that's some of our context. Why does that matter for us? Because we're going through the book of Luke, and for some reason, Luke has found it really important to talk a lot about John. So far, we've got this story of like the miraculous conception of John before we do the miraculous conception of Jesus. And then we've got John flipping around as an embryo in his mother's womb when she comes across pregnant Mary. And he seems to indicate, like, even as an embryo, he knows that Jesus is pretty awesome. They're cousins. That's pretty important to Luke for us to know. And then we've got another story of when John is born. We also have, like, shenanigans by angels happening in this. Keep in mind, like, there was an angel who appeared. He told his dad, hey, you're going to end up having a son named John the Baptist. He's awesome. He's going to do work for God. And Zechariah is like, how can this be? He goes, well, I'm going to give you a sign, and you can know this is going to happen, because for the next 9 months, you're not going to be able to talk. Which is pretty brutal to me. Sorry about that. All right, so that's all John. Precious little baby John. Then we get to full-grown John. In the wilderness John. Eating locust John. Wearing camel hair John. He's a serious guy. He's the kind of guy that you look at and you go, that guy does not like to be comfortable. And I think for a lot of folks, they took this as a sign of like, well, that must mean he's really serious about God. The John the Baptist movement ended up being a very big deal in its day. John was better known than Jesus in the immediate time frame of the destruction of the temple. And while we have some overlap of the ministries of Jesus and the ministry of John, while we have some overlap of the disciples of Jesus and the disciples of John, we also have traditions that continue forward with both. And this is part of why Luke depicts them as cousins, because Luke sees the two groups as connected. They are cousin groups. They don't need to be in competition with each other. They're cousin movements. But then he's also making this point that John and his movement is preparing the way for Jesus. Which is a little bit of a claim of like, John is pretty awesome. Jesus is more awesome. Now this is Luke. This is Luke's telling of the story. We actually have a group of Gnostics today who continue to lay claim to John the Baptist as their main figure. I just learned this week. That blew my mind. All right. So we've got John the Baptist. Luke really wants us to pay attention to what he's got to say. He's aware that he's got to properly characterize this. He's laying the groundwork. He wants folks to see this continuity between John the Baptist and Jesus. They don't have to be in competition with each other. They can be in continuity. They can be in cooperation. And John also introduces these themes that are very important for the rest of our book of Luke as well. Yes, he does shout out to the crowd, "You brood of vipers," which is pretty thorny, pretty bristly. Diana, when she was preparing for this, asked me if I was going to come in here and call us all names, and I told her no. Well, his point in that is, hey, I think many of you are here trying to save your own skin. You don't really care about what I've got to say. You're maybe a little concerned that I'm telling you there's going to be some heavy hardship up ahead. The way he characterizes this is the wrath of God. Now, theologically, I don't view God this way. Our writer of Luke does. He sees that maybe there is a connection between the pain we encounter in life and maybe God's judgment. John seems to see it this way. I disagree. Regardless, though, he's warning them of a catastrophe up ahead. And he thinks they need to change direction in order to avoid that catastrophe. And he's calling this out a little bit. And then he says, it is not enough for you to rest on your religious and national identity as special chosen people of God, as children of Abraham. It's not enough, he says. So anyway, this claim of exclusiveness, of chosenness, I think it could be a very comforting one for us. We have a special relationship with God. How does God relate to us? Family. Children of this person he had a special relationship with, Abraham. but it can also be pretty supremacist. If we rest in an identity as chosen people, thinking that's going to save us from catastrophe when other people have to deal with catastrophe, we're guilty of this, of thinking that the mistakes of our birth, the accidents that we have no control over, thank you, will dictate what happens in our lives. That the final word of it all is just whatever category you were born into. And John's saying no. If God wanted, God could turn the very stones into children of Abraham. It's not about where you're born into. It's not about your religious identity. It's not about your national identity. God wants more than that. And I read that, and I see parallels today. For those who care to hear, there is a message we must listen to from this voice crying out in the wilderness, because we too face an uncertain future. We too live in days of trouble. Perhaps we also hope to hear a word that our skins will be saved, just like these people that John calls a brood of vipers. Is that so bad? But there's another comparison to be made that I think a lot of Christians don't want to see. Loud voices that claim we are God's people as a nation, or we are God's people religiously. And so, because we are children of Abraham, we are Americans, God has chosen us. And I think John would have the same response for us that he's got for these crowds. Your claims of chosenness are meaningless to God. I tell you that God can raise up Americans. God can raise up Christians from these very stones. What good is that? So the crowds respond to John, well, what should we do then? And John says, if you've got more clothing than you need, give the extra to those who lack clothing. And if you've got more food than you need, give the extra to those who lack food. Some tax collectors come up to John, and ask him, well, what can we do? These are folks whose job it is to collect money from their neighbors to send to their oppressor, Rome. How much control over all of this do they have? I'm not really sure how much control they have. But there is one thing they can control, whether or not they're doing so honestly. So John tells them, you know what? Only collect what you need to. Which implies there's a lot of tax collectors who are taking a lot more than they need to. And this is a more mixed group than we initially think. It's not just Jewish people. There's also Roman soldiers present, Gentiles, colonizers. And they come to John and they ask, well, what can we do? And John says, you know, how about you stop extorting people and lying about them? Do only what you need to do. That's not totally the answer I would have liked to see. I would have preferred, like, quit, you know? But again, I don't know how much control over these things these people have. Also, anybody ever serve in the military in this room? What happens if you abandon your fellow soldiers in the middle of an assignment? Bad things. Yes. Same in Roman times, it turns out. Quite surprisingly, I'm sure, for many of us. And the point is, if you're doing wrong, stop doing the wrong and start doing what's right. We don't have to be stuck in these patterns. Now, I believe that God does not seek to harm any of us, because in my theological perspective, God is the source of all that is good, the source of all that is love, and persistently calls us away from the evils of our time, from our paths of hurt and exploitation and violence. And God is calling our worlds away from these things as well, because we can do better. Our worlds can be better. Our world will be better, as our ancestors believed. And we also, as individuals, can grow. We can improve. And I don't think of this in strictly like moralistic ways, although there is that. If you're an employer and you're not paying your folks what they need to get by or to thrive, I think John would have a word for you, for example. But I think it's also for those of us who are stuck in toxic patterns, or maybe have had that experience in the past. We have to continuously remember we can heal. We can recover. I've got a family member that I love very much. He's in jail right now. He's wrestled with addiction a lot since COVID. And it breaks my heart to see him in the position he's in. And there's been times I've been tempted to just try to turn that part of me off that hopes he could heal, hopes that he can grow. But I can't do that. I can't give up on him. Part of that is God's not given up on me and my own healing of toxic behaviors, my own path of self-harm. And I don't want to give up on any of our neighbors. We have so many folks who come in through these doors who are in a situation very similar to my family member. And I'm not giving up on them. So I'm not going to give up on him. Ironically, for the first time in years, he's clean because he's in jail. And I've noticed a little bit of change in the way he talks. I don't know if he's going to come out of this experience committed to that difficult road of recovery. But I'm not going to give up on him. Just like I'm not going to give up on any of us dealing with our own toxicness. And I'm not going to give up on our country dealing with its own sins of supremacy. I'm not going to give up on our city, who continuously talks about addressing the issues that affect us. Homelessness, lack of food, and so on. We can do better. We can grow. God's not finished with us. Amen.